The bruise on Clara's jaw had faded to yellow, but the words still burned fresh as branding iron. "You're nothing but a burden, girl, always have been." Her father's voice echoed in the empty cabin as she folded the last of her mother's quilts into a worn saddlebag. 3 days since he'd said it. 3 days since he'd made it clear she had until sunrise to find somewhere else to call home. The Montana wind howled through gaps in the cabin walls, carrying the scent of coming snow. October in the territory meant harsh months ahead, and Clara had nowhere to go, no relatives, no prospects. At 19, she possessed little more than calloused hands from years of cooking, cleaning, and tending to a man who saw her as nothing more than another mouth to feed since her mother died birthing a son who lasted only hours. She pressed her face against the frosted window, watching her father's silhouette move between the barn and the house. He'd been drinking since noon, celebrating his freedom. No doubt. Tomorrow he'd sell the cabin to the railroad men who'd been circling like vultures, take his money and disappear into whatever hole drunken men crawled into when they shed their last responsibility. Clara's fingers traced the edge of her mother's wedding ring, now hanging from a thin chain around her neck. Her mother had whispered stories of kind men who existed somewhere beyond these mountains. Men who saw women as partners, not burdens, but those felt like fairy tales now as distant as the stars barely visible through the storm clouds gathering overhead. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart skip. Through the window she watched a lone rider emerge from the swirling snow, tall in his saddle, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. Even through the storm she could see the confidence in his posture, the way his horse responded to his gentle guidance. This wasn't a drifter or a drunk. This was a man with purpose. Her father stumbled from the barn, bottle in hand, squinting through the snow at the approaching stranger. Clara pressed closer to the glass, watching as the rider dismounted with fluid grace. Something in his movement spoke of strength held in careful control, of power that didn't need to prove itself. When the stranger removed his hat and looked directly at the cabin window, Clara stepped back into shadow, but not before she caught sight of his face, weathered but kind, with eyes that seemed to see everything without judgment. "Name's Jacob Stern," the stranger said, his voice carrying easily through the thin cabin walls. "Heard you might be looking to sell." Clara crept closer to the door, listening as her father's words slurred together. "Depends on what you're offering. Railroad men been sniffing around, but they ain't serious buyers. I'm not interested in the land for railroad purposes." Jacob's voice remained steady, patient. "I run cattle 20 miles north, looking for winter shelter for my hands. Maybe expand the operation come spring." Through the crack in the door, Clara watched her father sway, sizing up this potential buyer. Jacob stood perfectly still, snow collecting on his broad shoulders, waiting while her father's whiskey-soaked mind processed the opportunity. "There's a complication," her father finally said, gesturing vaguely toward the cabin. "Got a daughter, 19 years old and never been nothing but trouble. Part of any deal she'd need handling." Clara's breath caught in her throat. He was selling her along with the property, like livestock. Jacob was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he'd heard. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Take her off my hands, marry her, work her, I don't care. Just make sure she ain't my problem anymore." Her father took another pull from his bottle. "Girl's got some use in her, I suppose. Cooks decent, keeps house, might breed well enough." The silence stretched until Clara thought she might scream. She pressed her hand against her mouth, fighting the urge to burst through that door and tell them both what she thought of their business arrangement. But where would she go? Into the storm, into a winter that would kill her before Christmas. "I'd want to speak with her," Jacob said finally. "Any arrangement involving a person's life should include their voice." Her father laughed, harsh and bitter. "She ain't got no choice in it. I'm her PA, and she'll do as I say." Nevertheless, Jacob's tone carried a steel edge now. "I speak with her or there's no deal." Clara heard her father cursing under his breath, then his heavy footsteps approaching the door. She barely had time to step back before he yanked it open. "Clara, get out here. Man wants to look at what he's buying. The cold hit her like a physical blow as she stepped onto the porch. Jacob's eyes met hers immediately, and she saw something unexpected there, not the calculating gaze of a man examining livestock, but genuine concern. He studied her face, taking in the faded bruise, the fear she couldn't quite hide, the defiant tilt of her chin despite everything.
"Oh,
Miss Clara," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Jacob Stern. Your father and I are discussing the sale of this property. I understand there might be additional considerations." Before Clara could respond, the thunder of approaching horses split the mountain air. At least 6 riders emerged from the swirling snow, led by a man Clara recognized with a sinking heart, Frank Morrison, the railroad's lead negotiator. But these weren't businessmen. They wore guns like men who knew how to use them, and their faces held the hard edges of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Well, well," Morrison called out, his voice cutting through the wind. "Looks like we got ourselves a little auction here." Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, then stopped. Clara counted the riders again, 6 against 1, and her father too drunk to be anything but a liability. The smart move would be for Jacob to mount up and ride away, let the railroad men have their land and their problems. "Morrison," her father slurred, suddenly looking more sober, "thought you weren't coming back till next week." "Plans change." Morrison's eyes locked onto Clara, and she felt something cold crawl up her spine. "Heard tell you've got more than just land to bargain with. Boys and we've been riding hard. Might be interested in a little hospitality." The meaning in his words hit Clara like a slap. She stepped backward, closer to Jacob, who had gone perfectly still. The air itself seemed to tighten, like the moment before lightning strikes. "The lady's not part of any negotiation," Jacob said quietly. Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Lady, this here's Tom Whitfield's burdened daughter. Been the talk of 3 counties. How eager he is to be rid of her. We figure we can solve everyone's problems." Clara's father looked between the railroad men and Jacob, his whiskey-clouded mind finally grasping the danger he'd invited to his door. "Now hold on, Morrison. We had a gentleman's agreement. Agreements change." Morrison dismounted, his men following suit, especially when new opportunities present themselves. Jacob stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and the approaching men. "You'll ride back where you came from, now 6 against 1, stranger. I like those odds. Then you haven't been paying attention." Jacob's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every man heard it. "Miss Clara, go inside, lock the door." She wanted to move, but her feet felt frozen to the porch boards. This man, this stranger, was about to fight 6 armed men to protect her. A woman he'd met 5 minutes ago, a burden her own father was eager to be rid of. Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun. "Last chance to ride away, cowboy." Jacob shook his head slowly. "I don't abandon women to men like you." The first shot cracked through the mountain air. Clara found herself pressed against the cabin wall, heart hammering as gunfire erupted in the yard. But the shots weren't random. Jacob moved with calculated precision, using the porch support beam as cover, while her father scrambled drunkenly for the barn. Through the chaos, she watched Jacob's face remain calm, focused, like a man who'd faced worse odds and survived. When the shooting stopped, 3 of Morrison's men lay motionless in the snow. Morrison himself clutched a wounded shoulder, his remaining men helping him toward their horses. "This ain't over, stranger." "Yes it is," Jacob called back, his gun still trained on the retreating figures. "Don't come back." As the hoofbeats faded, Clara stepped from the cabin. Jacob was checking his gun, reloading with steady hands despite the violence that had just erupted. She'd never seen a man move like that, deadly when necessary, but without cruelty or swagger. "You're hurt," she said, noticing blood on his sleeve. "Just a graze." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "Are you all right?" The question was so simple, so genuine, that Clara felt her throat tighten. When was the last time anyone had asked about her well-being? "Why did you do that?" "You don't even know me." Jacob holstered his gun and stepped closer. I know enough. I know you've been carrying bruises that didn't come from falling. I know your father talks about you like property, and I know you stood your ground when those men came, even when you were scared. Clara touched her jaw unconsciously. He said I was a burden, then he's a fool. Jacob's voice was gentle but certain. I've been watching you through that window, saw how you folded those quilts, how you handled yourself when things got dangerous. That's not burden behavior, that's strength. She felt tears threatening and fought them back. You don't have to pretend. I heard what he was offering, saw how you looked at me like I might be worth something. Jacob was quiet for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth with age. My mother gave me this before she died, told me to save it for the woman who made me believe in forever. Clara stared at the pouch, then at his face. You don't even know me, she repeated, but softer now. I know you're brave, I know you're alone, and I know that when your father called you a burden, every part of me wanted to tell him he was wrong. Jacob's eyes held hers steadily. I'm not asking you to love me, Clara. I'm asking you to let me prove that some men see partners where others see problems. Clara's father emerged from the barn, sobered by violence and the realization that his problems had multiplied rather than disappeared. The railroad men will be back, he said, avoiding her eyes. Bring more guns next time. No, they won't, Jacob said firmly. Morrison's hurt, his men are spooked, and word travels fast in these mountains. They'll find easier land to claim. He turned to Clara's father. But you're right about one thing. It's not safe here anymore. I got nowhere else to go, her father mumbled. Jacob studied the broken man for a long moment. There's a town 2 days south, railroads hiring laborers, works honest, pays regular, give you a fresh start if you can stay away from the bottle. Clara watched her father's face cycle through emotions, surprise, suspicion, something that might have been gratitude. You'd do that, after how everyone deserves a second chance to be better than they were. An hour later, Clara stood on the porch, watching her father ride south, sober for the first time in months, carrying supplies Jacob had insisted on providing. The cabin felt different already, lighter somehow, as if years of accumulated bitterness had ridden away with him. Are you sure about this? Clara asked as Jacob loaded the last of her belongings onto his pack horse. Taking in a stranger, starting a life with someone you barely know. Jacob secured the ropes, then came to stand beside her. I've spent 5 years building a ranch, waiting for something I couldn't name. When I saw you in that window tonight, saw how you held yourself together when everything was falling apart, I knew what I'd been waiting for. Clara looked back at the cabin one last time. Her mother had died here, her father had broken here, but she had survived here. That counted for something. Your ranch, she said, is it really 20 miles north? 22 actually, through some of the most beautiful country you've ever seen. Jacob helped her onto her horse, his hands gentle but sure. Mountains that turn purple at sunset, meadows full of wild flowers come spring, and a house that's been empty too long. As they rode into the clearing storm, Clara felt the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. Behind them, snow began covering the tracks of violence and old pain. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility, the kind her mother had whispered about in fairy tales. Years later, standing in the doorway of the house, Jacob had built larger to accommodate the children who filled it with laughter. Clara would remember this night, how a stranger had seen worth where her own blood had seen burden, how sometimes the most important journeys began, not with love, but with a simple recognition that some people were worth fighting for. The mountains still turned purple at sunset, and the meadows still bloomed with wild flowers each spring, but Clara no longer watched them alone.